Sanctuary cities. To some, the concept isn't as American as the Declaration of Independence, a way to keep the American dream alive for the people and communities that need it most. For others, the mere mention of a sanctuary city elicits the same response as an old space wizard driving into a desert town: condemnation as a wretched hive of scum and villainy. For nearly 2 decades, few issues have been so divisive in American politics as the idea that individual US cities, and at times even US states, would refuse to cooperate with federal immigration law and instead offer refuge to people who might otherwise be deported. It's an idea that's created entire movements, swung elections, and led to fear, hope, and bitterness on all sides. So let's dive in. Alright, now before we get too deep into the topic of sanctuary cities, let's establish our terms, shall we? Now, we here at Political Fronts understand that we won't be changing many minds today. Really though, we're not here to change minds. We trust that the vast majority of American viewers watching this episode already know where they stand on the idea of sanctuary cities. And not only that, but we trust that those who haven't yet made up their minds can very easily find people on all sides of the political spectrum who'd like to convince you that their way is the right way. That's not what we do here on Political Fronts, and it's not something we're going to try and do today. Instead, we're going to do the thing that we promised in the title. We're going to explore exactly why sanctuary cities split the American public so completely, why we've got one side strongly in support, one side strongly opposed, and each side believing that the other is absolutely mental. Now, before we do that, however, we've got to establish our terms, starting with the surprisingly complicated matter of what a sanctuary city actually is. Unfortunately, and as we'll keep coming back to over the course of today's episode, there is no universally agreed definition of what a sanctuary jurisdiction is in the United States, but there is at least a basic premise that we can draw on. For all practical purposes, a sanctuary city is a city that's placed limits around its own cooperation with federal agencies that enforce immigration law across the United States. Sanctuary cities either don't cooperate or cooperate in a limited way with efforts to deport illegal or undocumented migrants who violate federal law via their presence in the US. Those terms, by the way, we'll use interchangeably over the course of this episode in order to discuss an immigration status that both terms attempt to describe. Alright, so the movement to establish sanctuary cities started all the way back in the 1980s in response to a wave of migration to the United States by asylum seekers who were fleeing ruinous civil wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, and elsewhere. Now, back then, the sanctuary movement drew largely on support from Christian groups in the American Southwest and states that were impacted the most by these waves of migrants traveling across the US border with Mexico. The movement caught on within just a few years, and after a 1985 decision by the city of San Francisco to pass ordinance preventing the use of city funds and resources to assist federal immigration enforcement, city and county sanctuary laws began to pop up across the country. Now, of course, a lot has changed in America since that time. While a fair proportion of migrants still come from Central America, many come from Venezuela and elsewhere in South America, while a growing proportion hail from elsewhere across the globe. America's legal immigration system remains bloated, inefficient, hard to navigate, and ill-equipped to deal with the realities of today's world, even as the reasons that people migrate to the US have continued to evolve. The cornerstone of sanctuary laws, however, remains unchanged. That would be the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which prevents the federal government from forcing states to take specific actions or compelling state or local officials to take part in federal projects. Basically, if the federal government wants to do something that's not enshrined in the US Constitution, state and municipal authorities reserve the right to simply choose not to comply. As US courts have established many times over, including in the Supreme Court, the enforcement of immigration law is exclusively the domain of the federal government, meaning that the right not to comply is extended to state and local officials on that issue. State and local authorities can and often will assist with immigration enforcement efforts if the federal government invites them to, and they can't engage in immigration enforcement that the federal government doesn't approve. But they are not mandated to comply with federal immigration law if they don't choose to. And now it's here that we get into not one, but two of the sticky bits around sanctuary cities that'll drive a lot of the controversy that we'll address later. Sticky bit number one is that sanctuary laws do not include steps to conceal the existence of migrants in sanctuary cities or explicitly protect them from deportation. Federal immigration enforcement officers, including those working with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, can still enter sanctuary cities, identify and detain migrants who are in the US illegally, and deport them as they see fit. They just won't get any help from local officials in the process. If ICE sends what's called an immigration detainer, basically a request to place a person into criminal custody until ICE agents arrive, then officials obeying a local sanctuary law will decline to act on the detainer. Sanctuary law does not entitle cities to send their police officers into a standoff with ICE agents or to otherwise deliberately obstruct the work of federal officials. Nor can a person who's detained by ICE while physically located in a sanctuary city expect their experience to be any different than any other detained person while in federal custody. Put simply, sanctuary law, on its own, does not give anybody the means to obstruct federal immigration enforcement. It simply makes clear that a sanctuary jurisdiction won't be assisting in these efforts. The second sticky bit is that those same sanctuary laws do not exempt migrants from other US laws. Cities, states, or counties can technically ignore other parts of federal law under the 10th Amendment, and it's their prerogative to do so, but if a certain jurisdiction has chosen to do that, then it's through measures that are unrelated to sanctuary laws. And in a very important note, migrants are just as subject to criminal law as any other person. Somebody who's in the US illegally and protected by sanctuary law doesn't get to run around murdering people any more than a US citizen in that same place. A fair number of opponents of sanctuary law have made public claims that that is not the case and that sanctuary law entitles migrants to break all sorts of other laws, but that just isn't accurate. Migrants who commit crimes are subject to criminal law, and importantly, the US Supreme Court has held that, quoting the court itself here, as a general rule, it is not a crime for a removable alien to remain in the United States. Removable alien, by the way, is apparently Supreme Court speak for what most Americans refer to as either an undocumented or an illegal immigrant, which is to say that being undocumented or illegally present is not a federally recognized crime by itself. Federal authorities still deport lots and lots of people, and they have done so for a very long time, but in most cases, the people getting deported here are not deported on criminal grounds. Sanctuary cities can, however, go beyond the mandate of simple non-cooperation with law enforcement if they choose to. First, they can prevent officials under their jurisdiction from being deputized by the federal government in a loophole that would get them to comply with federal orders. Jurisdictions might also prohibit any contracts that would allow federal immigration officials to hold immigrants using local detention centers or prevent the construction of immigrant detention centers in the city, state, or county that they administer. Sanctuary cities might choose to prohibit local law enforcement from sharing information about migrants with federal enforcement agencies, or they might collaborate with private institutions like churches or religious organizations, nonprofits, or community groups that offer additional services to migrants in their role as private groups. Critically, the mere fact that a jurisdiction has passed a sanctuary law doesn't mean that they're necessarily taking any of these other steps, but they can if they choose. And finally, it's important to understand both where sanctuary jurisdictions are and where they aren't. Several US states have adopted sanctuary laws statewide, including but not limited to Colorado, New Jersey, and the 3 states that make up America's continental West Coast: California, Oregon, and Washington. Other states, while falling short of adopting statewide sanctuary laws, have created a legal environment to support cities that want to take that step. Those include the states of Massachusetts and New York on the East Coast and New Mexico along the southern border. Conversely, well over a dozen states ban sanctuary cities, including Texas and Arizona along the northern border, Montana in the northwest, and most of the deep south except Louisiana. Many individual cities have adopted sanctuary laws, including some of America's largest: New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Others, like Atlanta, Denver, Cleveland, Detroit, Baltimore, and New Orleans, are often described as sanctuary cities in the media, but they haven't actually passed any ordinance to that effect. Sometimes they get that label because of other immigration-related policies that don't include formal sanctuary status, and sometimes they're slapped with the label for more overtly political reasons. In all, hundreds of US cities and counties have either formally adopted sanctuary law or have taken steps that are often regarded as being synonymous with sanctuary status, like refusing to honor ICE detainers. The thing that's especially important to understand as we move forward is that actually being a sanctuary city, a sanctuary state, or some other kind of sanctuary jurisdiction is different from being labeled one for media or rhetorical purposes. As is often the case in US politics, certain buzzwords tend to take on a life of their own, adopting an abstract or generalized meaning when they're used in political messaging, media reporting, or public discourse. There is no penalty for a person or organization that chooses to refer to a city as being a sanctuary city, despite it not actually having adopted sanctuary law. As a result, it's really common to hear the term sanctuary city applied to cities that don't have sanctuary laws in place, but take other steps to support or protect migrants from federal immigration enforcement. Since the phrase itself, sanctuary city, is a neat little term that most people recognize, it's become a very common fixture in discussions and arguments about all manner of immigration-related issues, both in communities supportive of sanctuary law and in communities opposed. So, with at least a working understanding of what sanctuary jurisdictions really are, let's start with the arguments in favor, and let's start those with a discussion about crime. It's a particularly common criticism of sanctuary cities that they're hotbeds for criminal activity and that illegal migrants are emboldened by sanctuary laws and don't suffer any repercussions when they commit crimes. And look, we've discussed that legally speaking, that's not the case. But the preponderance of empirical evidence suggests a conclusion one step further than that crime, by the numbers, does not increase in cities where sanctuary laws are in effect. Now, it's very easy in today's media environment to find empirical studies or things claiming to be empirical studies that basically say whatever you'd like them to. In fact, while we're on the subject, let us know in the comments below if you'd like us to dig into how that whole mess came to be. But look, the vast majority of peer-reviewed empirical studies on the subject indicate that sanctuary status either doesn't impact crime rates in a jurisdiction or leads to lower crime rates overall. Those studies have been done in all manner of ways, comparing cities to themselves before versus after sanctuary ordinance was passed or banned, comparing sanctuary cities to non-sanctuary cities, and a whole lot more. Now, the viewpoint that sanctuary cities actually lead to reductions in crime is a well-worn argument for those in favor of the practice, often drawing on well-established findings that both the overall immigrant community in the US, and specifically illegal immigrants, commit crimes at lower rates than native-born US citizens. Quoting the libertarian think tank the Cato Institute here, the evidence is overwhelming that immigrants in the United States have had a lower crime rate than native-born Americans since at least the 19th century. When people learn that fact, they aren't surprised that legal immigrants have a lower crime rate than native-born Americans, but they are surprised that it's also true for illegal immigrants. End quote. Proponents of sanctuary law will argue that the combination of lower crime rates by illegal immigrants overall and the elimination of a range of societal and institutional pressures that migrants face will lower their incentives to commit crimes. Under that logic, a person who's fundamentally on the run at all times may feel as if they have to live outside the law, thus creating an incentive to commit various types of crimes and avoid detection, rather than engaging with above-board institutions in ways that might lead them to be identified and detained. But if the fear of being detained and deported goes away, that same person might be more willing to comply with the legal structure overall and commit fewer crimes as a result. At the same time, migrants who don't have a reason to fear that a local police officer might decide to detain them on ICE's behalf will be more likely to solicit the help of local police or other officials if they need help or if they know of criminals who pose a threat to them or society. If a community feels as if people can safely report crimes that have happened to them, then potential bad actors in that community have to take law enforcement into account. A person who's comfortable asking for help from a local shelter or community food bank won't have a need to commit property crimes like shoplifting just to get their next meal. When migrant communities can live without a culture of fear, many of the incentives that prompt people to engage in criminal acts can be addressed in a more productive way. And with that comes a deeper argument on both the nature of immigration to the United States and the nature of the US itself. America has long prided itself on its history as a nation of immigrants, and in the early 2020s, over 40% of people in the United States are either first-generation Americans, second-generation Americans, or people who have themselves immigrated to the US. The choice to come to America in search of a better life is a core part of the American ethos. So proponents of sanctuary cities will argue what's a person to do when confronted by both the potential to make something better for themselves in America and a deeply dysfunctional legal immigration system that may take decades to process their claims. What if that same person is in danger in their home nation now and needs to leave for their own well-being? Those considerations are made even more important by an awareness of the difficult and at times dire circumstances facing people who've chosen to come to the US. Often those people make a very dangerous journey across continents, risking life and limb because the decision really is worth all that risk. For those same people to be mistreated, criminalized, and ultimately expelled once they finally reach the nation that claimed to embrace the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses would be deeply antithetical to that concept of America. Instead, within this line of thinking, the American ethos would motivate a nation that does have the financial and social resources to offer safe haven to do precisely that. There's also a detailed economic argument in favor of sanctuary cities, resting on an uncomfortable but unavoidable reality of modern American capitalism. Migrants who don't have authorization to be in the United States make up a very large proportion of workers in vital industries. According to the American Immigration Council, nearly 14% of construction workers are undocumented, nearly 13% of agricultural workers, 7% of hospitality workers, and over 5% of warehouse and manufacturing workers, all according to 2022 figures. In 2022, the US was estimated to rely on over 6 million undocumented workers across all fields. Not only that, but those same workers are typically the ones working in the least desirable jobs in exchange for the lowest wages. That might include harvesting vegetables and crops by hand in the hot sun, completing fast, dangerous, or precarious construction builds, working overnight shifts all across the manufacturing and hospitality industries, and more. Those are jobs that Americans simply don't want to work and that companies would bankrupt themselves trying to entice Americans into if migrant labor suddenly became unavailable. So, the argument goes, if this is the system that the United States relies on, then sanctuary law is a necessary step in preserving that system. After all, companies can't fill these undesirable positions if the only people interested in filling them have all been deported. There's a human argument that goes along with America's reliance on undocumented workers, pointing out the unfairness of America holding the constant threat of deportation over people's heads while living off the spoils of their work. But there's also a practical argument that sanctuary laws allow American companies that rely on immigrant labor to thrive while keeping prices lower for Americans than if those same companies had to pay US citizens for their labor. The earnings of illegal migrants, including those living in sanctuary jurisdictions, are taxed just the same as any other American earner, despite the fact that those migrants don't qualify for most of the social services that their taxes pay into. Thus, sanctuary laws are a way to ensure that a system that the US relies on isn't deprived of migrant workers who US citizens can't or wouldn't replace. And the data that sanctuary city advocates can leverage to explain the benefits of the overall policy can be pretty convincing. Here we'll draw upon figures presented by the American Immigration Council in its overview of sanctuary policies. Those include an average of 35.5 fewer crimes committed per 10,000 people in communities that do not honor ICE detainers, and a finding that, quote, no studies have demonstrated a link between sanctuary policies and increased crime. Poverty rates are 2.3% lower in counties that don't honor ICE detainers, median household income is over $4,000 higher, and both trends benefit not just the Latino community, but white and black communities as well. Countries that don't honor ICE detainers have lesser need for food stamp programs and lesser need for public assistance programs for children, while they also have lower unemployment rates. Of course, as we said before, and as we'll probably say many times on this channel in future episodes, you can find studies or things that resemble studies to support basically any claim on any side of this issue. But reliable, peer-reviewed empirical studies indicate a wide range of tangible benefits when sanctuary policies are in effect. But now, let's turn our attention to the other side of the equation, that sanctuary cities are not, in fact, a positive addition to American society, but are very much the opposite. We'll start with a constitutional argument that has historically struggled to win in US courts, but that still gets some degree of play in conservative circles across America. That the 10th Amendment that we discussed earlier either doesn't or shouldn't enable states or cities to opt out of US immigration law. That is to say, the entire legal premise that allows sanctuary cities to exist should be considered false. The arguments for this legal interpretation will typically come in one of two ways: that the 10th Amendment just isn't applicable to immigration law, or the other argument that even if the 10th Amendment is technically applicable to immigration law, the courts should make an exception because of the situation that America now faces. The argument that the 10th Amendment simply doesn't apply to immigration has historically struggled to pass muster in court. In a practical sense, there's very little to differentiate immigration law from all the other forms of law that are subject to the constraints of the amendment, at least according to US courts. But many opponents of sanctuary law insist this is an incorrect or faulty interpretation. As one conservative commentator, Hans von Spakovsky, put in a 2017 article via the Heritage Foundation under the title, "Sanctuary Cities, That's a Constitutional Hell No," quoting, "While there are many areas over which the states and the federal government share responsibility, or where the 10th Amendment gives responsibility to the states, immigration is not one of them. The states have no authority in these areas at all. They can no more dispute the immigration rules established by Congress than they could dispute the tariffs imposed back in 1832. The argument that a constitutional exception should be applied to immigration law is typically the one with a better chance of success. Sometimes the reason for the exception is rooted in concerns about the rule of law and the claim that cities or states should, on principle, not be able to openly defy the federal government. Other times, however, it drives at the far broader perception of sanctuary cities as being unsafe, violent, and at times lawless. Take a recent series of condemnations of sanctuary cities issued by a prominent member of the US House of Representatives, a Republican James Comer, while opening a hearing to question the mayors of several sanctuary cities this past February. Said Comer, quote, "The mayors here today each lead a so-called sanctuary city. And let's be clear, these policies only create sanctuaries for criminals. Sanctuary policies violate federal immigration law by protecting criminal aliens at the expense of the American people. Sanctuary cities and states refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement efforts and harbor illegal aliens. Sanctuary cities release criminal illegal aliens back onto the streets where they often go on to commit more crimes." End quote. During those remarks, Comer drew on an example of violence that took place in Chicago after city authorities disregarded an ICE detainer against migrants in the US illegally who had attempted to lure a minor and who, after his release by the city, killed a 63-year-old man in an act that would have been averted if he'd been in ICE custody. It's very common for opponents of sanctuary cities to elevate and amplify accounts similar to this one as a justification of measures both against sanctuary cities specifically and in favor of stricter immigration enforcement overall. As just one example, the first bill Donald Trump signed into law during his second term was the Lake and Riley Act, a bill requiring federal detention of illegal migrants who'd been arrested for burglary or theft. The law is named after Lake and Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student who was killed by a Venezuelan migrant who had been released from prior detention in New York before ICE could intervene, and who had committed shoplifting crimes prior to that in the US. According to ICE figures presented to the US Congress in September of 2024, over 13,000 migrants in the US have been convicted of homicide, either in the US or in other nations abroad, and are currently living outside ICE detention in the US. Some of these people may still be incarcerated in prisons and jails that don't share data with ICE, but the core message of ICE officials remains the same, that the organization's inability to put dangerous migrants in direct custody leaves a dangerous blind spot and thus places US citizens at risk. According to ICE, over 435,000 migrants in total were listed as known, previously convicted criminals who were not in ICE detention as of the summer of 2024. Many of those people may have crossed into the United States via the southern border with Mexico, and while a portion of them would have been able to avoid detection, others would have been apprehended and then released by US border and customs officials who lack information on those same migrants' criminal history abroad. By this logic, it's ICE's prerogative to detain those individuals and ensure they can't do any harm to US citizens, and sanctuary city policies directly, explicitly, and quite proudly obstruct ICE's ability to do so. As prominent US Senator Ted Cruz put in 2023, reintroducing the Stop Dangerous Sanctuary Cities Act to Congress, quote, "So-called sanctuary cities refuse to enforce the laws on the books and release violent criminals in our country illegally, including and murderers who go on to prey on both American citizens and the immigrant community." Now, we've already mentioned the counter-arguments, the data showing that illegal migrants and immigrant communities overall commit crimes at lower rates than native-born US citizens, but those statistics don't tend to make much of an impact in the anti-sanctuary city world for a couple of reasons. First, the opposing logic goes that even one migrant in the US who's committing crimes is one more than should be allowed under US immigration enforcement laws. That is to say, there is no number of killings or rapes or other crimes by illegal immigrants that should ever be tolerated other than zero, because US law plainly states that people shouldn't be in the US illegally. Second, if sanctuary cities seek to protect migrants, known criminals with records in the US or elsewhere should be an exception. Those people should be treated as a threat to public safety and security rather than being treated in the same way as those with a clean record. There are also a more fundamental set of disagreements rooted in the same question of the American ethos that we talked about earlier. The arguments here are wide-ranging, but typically cluster around the premise that migrants who are present in the US without the required legal permissions should not simply be assumed to be safe and contributive members of society until proven otherwise. Instead, it should be the exact opposite. America isn't able to effectively keep track of people who've committed crimes in other countries, and it shouldn't have to. It's made a commitment to law and order on its citizens' behalf. And the mere idea that a person would be willing to enter the US illegally and stay, even if their record might be clean, is both a reason they should be treated as criminals and an indicator of their willingness to do illegal things. Under this line of thinking, sure, it's the American ethos to take on the tired and the poor and the huddled masses, but not without being able to dictate the conditions under which people enter the country. The American ethos may be to welcome immigrants, but that welcome is not unconditional. And then we've got to address a wide range of conspiracy theories that have become prevalent in the United States, in which sanctuary cities are a component of a broader threat to the nation. Great replacement theory, for example, insists that immigrants of non-white people into the United States is an ongoing and covert effort to replace white populations in majority white areas or otherwise dilute or eliminate their place in American society. According to a 2024 poll by the University of Massachusetts, 42% of respondents endorsed the idea that, quote, some elected officials want to increase immigration in order to bring in obedient voters who will vote for them. A core premise of Great Replacement theory, and one that drew 5% more support in that poll than when the same question was asked in 2022. Republicans, by the way, endorsed the idea at a rate of 73%. Other theorists, including high-profile members of the US legislature and federal law enforcement, believe that the United States' porous borders allow the entry of sleeper cells of foreign enemies working on behalf of China, Iran, organized crime in Latin America, the Islamic State, and any range of other perceived threats. In each case, sanctuary cities are just one part of a far more nefarious plot, but they draw extra ire because of their perceived role in obfuscating, enabling, or even supporting those plots outright. Moving away from the role of conspiracy, opponents also raise a range of more practical concerns about the impact of sanctuary cities on wider society. Many point to sanctuary city policies as a drain on the resources of the American taxpayer, as an influx of migrants is expected to result in increased demand for expensive social services programs. That's an argument that conservative leaders in the US have sought to amplify in the past, including busing campaigns by the Republican governors of Texas, Arizona, and Florida that saw thousands of migrants sent to sanctuary cities and states like New York City and Chicago. Those campaigns placed an unexpected strain on support services that were robust enough to handle those more northerly cities' regular influx of migrants, but couldn't handle what those southerly administrations described as the overwhelming deluge of migrants that they have had to deal with. As one commentary piece published by the Conservative Heritage Foundation put in 2022 at the height of the busing campaign, quote, sanctuary cities like Washington, D.C., New York City, and Chicago are sagging under the weight of the cost required to support these new arrivals. Now their mayors are complaining about it, apparently surprised that their poor policies have played out, well, poorly. Of course, border communities have been hit even harder by this problem. They've been struggling to cope with it for years. End quote. Meanwhile, the government benefits that undocumented migrants are entitled to in some sanctuary states and municipalities have drawn scorn and ridicule by opponents of sanctuary city policy. Take California, for instance, where migrants have benefited from cash assistance programs, family leave programs, in-state college tuition and financial aid programs, and other benefits that critics say have had clear negative repercussions for American citizens. A high share of undocumented migrants arrive to the US with very little in the way of physical resources, from clothing to medicine to even food or water, meaning that the need for social support is often acute and long-lasting if these people are going to remain in the US. Not only that, but pervasive unemployment problems across much of America have cultivated concerns that migrants are being employed at positions that would otherwise, or that should, go to native-born Americans. As anti-sanctuary city opponents argue the case, social support for migrants places an unfair burden on the American taxpayer at the same time that they reduce the amount of resources available to go around. And that, in turn, happens at the same time as sanctuary laws create an enabling culture, making illegal immigration seem like a more appealing prospect for people in other countries who might consider making the journey. All right, now we've got to emphasize here that the criticisms of sanctuary city policies that we've covered are not an exhaustive list, just as our explanation of the reasoning behind the support for sanctuary cities wasn't exhaustive either. But already, it's impossible to ignore the underlying problem, that these two sides can't seem to agree on the state of the problem, let alone actually collaborate to address it. To take one example, proponents of sanctuary cities will draw on a wealth of credible research showing that sanctuary cities either experience lower crime rates overall, or at the very least, that there's no clear difference in crime rates between sanctuary cities and everywhere else. At the same time, opponents of sanctuary cities will insist that immigrant crime is a mortal threat to American communities, emphasizing case-by-case evidence that depicts genuinely horrific crimes perpetrated by migrants that would have been detained and deported if the system worked in the way that opponents of sanctuary laws believe that it should. Similar divides can be found everywhere, from the way that social services for migrants are understood, to the way that America should deal with its dependence on migrant labor, to the very nature and guiding philosophy of the United States. Now, we said at the outset of this episode, and we'll say it again, if you're looking for somebody to make an argument either in support or in opposition to sanctuary cities, there is no shortage of people willing to make those arguments for you ad nauseum. For our part, however, we can only lay out the cases on each side. We can't come down on either side for you. Look, we as individuals do have individual stances on the idea of sanctuary cities, just as any person would. But quite frankly, a personal point of view doesn't matter. People who strongly support a policy like sanctuary cities may dismiss out of hand the arguments made by people who strongly oppose them. People who strongly oppose sanctuary policies are just as likely to dismiss the arguments in favor, and if a person wishes to dismiss those counter-arguments, then really, that's their prerogative. But doing so doesn't get either side anywhere on an issue that is all but intractable, exceptionally divisive, and has been approached and interpreted in such different ways by different states, cities, and federal administrations. If both sides continue on their current course, in a conversation where each side tends to tune the other out at the earliest possible convenience, then the issue can't be resolved in either direction. Only by entering conversations with at least a passing understanding of the other side's position could any real resolution be possible. In the short term, it's the Trump administration in control of the White House, and for now, it appears that momentum is on the side opposing sanctuary policies. Most recently, at the time of writing, the Trump administration has announced that it's working on, quote, papers to withhold all federal funding from sanctuary cities, as well as other cities with policies that limit their degree of cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. The Trump administration has launched direct challenges to sanctuary cities already in the form of escalating deportation efforts in predominantly left-leaning cities nationwide. The Internal Revenue Service, responsible for the US tax system, has struck a deal with ICE to use protected tax records to help identify and deport immigrants, a highly controversial step that led to several top IRS officials resigning. ICE is now empowered to detain undocumented people they come across while searching for other migrants targeted for removal, reversing a Biden-era policy, and, as we've mentioned before already, ICE is no longer subject to guidelines that would prevent them from operating in schools, churches, hospitals, and other areas previously deemed sensitive. Trump and his administration appear intent on taking a hatchet to the sanctuary city system, either by ending those policies outright if they can find the legal justification to do so, or otherwise via a campaign of obstruction meant to make the entire process untenable. Whether the White House is ultimately successful in that effort remains to be seen, but as time goes on, we're gonna find out one way or the other. That's where we end today's video. Thank you for watching, and if you'd like us to cover another issue like sanctuary cities in a future episode, let us know in the comments. It's a new channel. We'll do our best. See you next time.